the move to West Korea. No chronicle of activities in Korea would be complete without a discussion of the truce talks which began in the summer of 1951. When the Communists proposed these meetings early in June, their motives were transparent. They were hurt, staggering, and badly in need of a breathing spell. Pretending a sudden interest in peace, the hard-pressed enemy requested talks at Kaesong for the purpose of recuperation. The enemy would never admit the real damage he suffered. A typical excuse for the smashing CCF defeat was given in a book by Wilford G. Burchett, an Australian communist who was a press correspondent behind the Chinese lines. Immediately prior to the beginning of the talks, he explained, the Korean Chinese troops had withdrawn extensively along the East Coast, hoping to entice the Americans as deep as possible into a trap which would be sprung and would cut them off by an encircling move. The Americans were seriously nibbling at the bait when the proposal for ceasefire talks was made. The line was immediately frozen and Korean Chinese troops started to dig in. This beginning of static warfare was unquestionably the great turning point of a war whose course from that time on was to be decided at the conference table of Kaesong and later Panmunjom. Any doubts as to the actual motives of the Communists might have been dispelled upon reading in Burchett's book this naive boast of the advantage taken of the truce talks by the Reds. Digging in is an understatement of the way the Korean Chinese troops literally burrowed into the mountains, constructed 2- and 3-story dwellings underground, linked mountains and hills by underground tunnels, and carved deep communication trenches linking flank with flank and front with rear. They raked the insides of mountains as you would rake ashes out of a furnace. Each hill, mountain, or ridge was connected with its neighbors by deep, zigzagged intercommunication trenches, at least 2 yards below ground level and with yard-high anti-blast walls. In emergency, troops could be switched from hilltop to hilltop with the enemy never knowing. Similar trenches extended well to the rear, so that supplies could be brought up and withdrawals if necessary made in comparative safety. Everything was deep underground with many yards of rock and earth between them and shells and bombs, atomic or otherwise. Back of the front line positions, similar scooped-out mountain ridges stretched all the way back to Pyongyang and further. It was against these positions that Van Fleet began hurling his troops in August 1951. The breathing spell provided by preliminary truce talk discussions gave the Communists an opportunity they had not previously enjoyed. Not only did they have time to prepare sturdy and effective entrenchments, but they were able to bring up additional mortars and artillery to equal those of the Allied forces. As a further advantage, while free from the compulsion of impending military disaster, they made use of the interlude to reorganize and train NKPA divisions to a new and increased level of effectiveness. Communists are never embarrassed in the least to deny an agreement already reached, and once having accomplished their intermediate goal, the Red delegates broke off the Kaesong talks for a while. Once the pressure on them was reduced, the enemy was in a position to try to obtain the most favorable terms for armistice talks, even if it meant prolonging the fighting. The change in tactics soon became apparent. Since the opening of the Kaesong Conference, commented a FECOM G2 report, the enemy has deviated from his usual tactics of flexible defense which he so skillfully employed during the build-up period prior to all his past offensives, to that of a more orthodox fixed defense. Where the enemy in the past has defended key terrain features with relatively small groups to delay friendly forces, he has now changed over to tactics of a fixed line of defense to be defended at all costs. The most extended delay imposed upon the Korean Armistice Conference by the Communists was in connection with the exchange of prisoners of war, which subject will be discussed in Volume 5 of this series. The United Nations contended that all prisoners should be screened to determine whether they wished to return to their side of origin. No prisoner was to be returned against his wishes. The Communists claimed this treatment consisted of a reign of terror in which CCF prisoners were held at gunpoint. Some prisoners held in UN camps rioted and injuries and deaths resulted. This provided the Communists with excellent propaganda on which to denounce our principle of no forced repatriation. In the end, after a delay of more than 14 months of war, the Communists finally did accept this principle, and an armistice was achieved. The Communist delaying tactics were not entirely without benefits to the Allied forces, for the major part of the 1st Marine Division had the opportunity to go into reserve and engage in several weeks' intensive training. While the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing was busily participating in the interdiction activities of Operation Strangle, General Van Fleet and his ground commanders felt frustrated over their orders to sit tight rather than attack and prevent further enemy buildup. An agreement to resume ceasefire talks, this time at Panmunjom, led to a USAC order which committed the 1st Marine Division and other major units to a defensive stand behind a fixed line of demarcation on 20 September 1951. Further negotiations resulted in a month's lull, which was brought about by the fact that the delegates could not agree on where the lines would remain if the fighting stopped. The United States delegates pressed for a settlement within a 30-day period. The Communists continued to stall. The United States then consented to accept the present, then current, demarcation line if the Communists agreed within the 30-day period. The significance of these dates was to become more and more plain as the conflict dragged on into 1952 with both sides on the defensive, limiting themselves to the raids and patrols of positional warfare while the appointed representatives haggled for a truce. Although the Marines did not realize it, the war had already turned into a contest of watchful waiting and fierce local fights. This line of demarcation left the 8th Army holding a MLR across one of the narrowest parts of the peninsula. Just behind the Communist MLR, the peninsula bulged to the west. This meant that the enemy had to devote much of his effort to mining the waters and defense of many beaches against a surprise amphibious attack, and it necessitated keeping in operation long and vulnerable supply lines. It is probable that a UN breakthrough or successful amphibious operation could have been mounted at this time, for several high-ranking officers expressed such opinions. All the necessary ingredients were available, yet the high-level decision for such an operation was not made. Tactical innovations. Until World War II, it had been a deserved reproach throughout the brief history of our country that Americans were never prepared at the outset of a war. A welcome departure from this tenet came in 1942 when the Marine Corps and Navy introduced the new amphibious tactics they had developed during the 1930s. Victory in the Pacific War was due in large measure to the techniques, landing craft, and vehicles of the Navy Marine Corps ship-to-shore attack. As a result, North Africa, Europe, and the Japanese-occupied islands of the Pacific were open to invasion without a single major reverse. In contrast, Hitler's Wehrmacht lacked both the techniques and equipment to launch a cross-channel attack on England in 1940, and Operation Sea Lion was of necessity abandoned by an army that dominated the rest of Europe as a result of victories in land warfare. Again, in Korea, the Marines demonstrated their foresightedness by taking a prominent part in the development of such important innovations as combat helicopters, body armor, and thermal footwear. By the first month in 1952, the combat helicopter had proved to be of immeasurable assistance in modern warfare. In the beginning of the Korean War, the chopper was initially used for command and liaison flights and reconnaissance missions. Evacuation of casualties and rescue missions also became routine duties, and within a short time the helicopter became the favorite workhorse for a variety of tasks. In September of 1951, tactical troop movements began. These operations made newspaper headlines everywhere. Of greater tactical importance, at least in the opinion of the frontline rifleman, was the physical protection provided him. The armored vest and the new thermal boots were first tested by Marines late in 1951 and soon came to be highly desired items of equipment. The fighting men in Korea would not disagree with Benjamin Franklin's statement that there never was a good war, but modern inventions certainly improved conditions by providing for the safety and comfort of the fighting men. Marine transport helicopters and body armor were of particular importance because they added to the human resources of UN forces opposed by an enemy with a contempt for life, based on seemingly endless reserves of manpower. UN commanders in their fight against the communist forces could not recklessly expend lives as did the enemy. Therefore, the Allies had need of tactical innovations and life-saving devices in order to compensate for a lack of numbers. In the spring of 1952, when the UN and communist forces were facing each other from static positions and fighting local engagements, Operation Mixmaster took place. Mixmaster was a complicated rearrangement of UN divisions across the entire Korean front during March and involved the shuffling of about 200,000 men and their equipment over distances from 25 to 180 miles. It was a severe test of 8th Army mobility. General Van Fleet visited the 1st Marine Division CP on 12 March 1952 and announced an important command decision. After 6 months of defensive warfare in the same sector along line Minnesota, 20 September 1951 to 16 March 1952, the division was to move across the peninsula to West Korea. The Marines had orders to relieve the 1st ROK Division and take over a sector at the extreme left of the 8th Army line under the operational control of 1 Corps. There they would have the responsibility for blocking Korea's historic invasion route to Seoul. The reasons behind this USAC decision were summarized in the 1st Marine Division report as follows. 1. The abandonment of plans to carry out an amphibious envelopment somewhere on the East Coast. 2. Concern over weaknesses in the Kimpo area defenses. 3. The overall situation would not permit loss of ground on the USAC left, South Korea, as this would endanger the capital at Seoul. That if retraction of lines was necessary, territory could better be sacrificed on the right, North Korea, where the country was mountainous and had little economic or strategic value. Up to this time, the 4 Corps of the 8th Army had defended a 125-mile front across the peninsula with the following units in line from left to right on 15 March 1952. 1 Corps, ROK 1st Division, British Commonwealth Division, U.S. 3rd Infantry Division minus, U.S. 45th Infantry Division, Oklahoma National Guard, ROK 9th Division. In reserve were the ROK 8th Division and RCT 65 of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. 9 Corps, U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, ROK 2nd Division, U.S. 40th Infantry Division, California National Guard, ROK 3rd Division. In reserve were the U.S. 7th Infantry Division minus, RCT 17 of that division, and the ROK Capital Division. 10 Corps, ROK 7th Division, U.S. 25th Infantry Division, U.S. 1st Marine Division, including 1st KMC Regiment. In reserve was the ROK 6th Division minus. 1 ROK Corps, ROK 5th Division minus. In reserve was the ROK 11th Division minus. Allowing for a few changes, these were the positions held by major USAC units through the winter of 1951 to 1952. The Marine move was launched by Division Operation Plan 2-52 and provided that the 1st Marine Division would be relieved by the 8th ROK Division as a preliminary to movement overland and by sea to the relief of the 1st ROK Division and defense of Line Jamestown in the 1 Corps sector in the west. According to verbal orders later confirmed by USAC OI 272, transportation by truck and ship was specified, and the move was to be completed prior to 1 April. Obviously, such a transplacement, moving entire divisions great distances from one sector of the MLR to another, necessitated careful timing and close coordination, but the planners involved were equal to the task. In referring to detailed plans by the Division G3 section, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon D. Gale, and the G4 section, Colonel Robert A. McGill, several unit commanders expressed the opinion that the move from east to west was a masterpiece of logistical efficiency with no unnecessary paperwork and no undue harassment. In addition to transporting the division, the arrival of replacements and departure of personnel to be rotated to the United States were smoothly coordinated into the overall plan. The transport, General W. H. Gordon, anchored at Sakcho-ri on 16 March with 174 officers and 1,135 enlisted men of the 18th replacement draft. The newly arrived Marines scarcely had time to drop their sea bags before they joined the motor march to West Korea. The Gordon departed with 103 officers and 1,135 Marines homeward bound, and the 2nd Logistical Command, Army, received a 1st Marine Division request to route the 19th replacement draft, due in April, to Inchon instead of Sakcho-ri. At K-50, near Sakcho-ri on the east coast, air freight and passenger service was discontinued and diverted to the new division airhead, K-16, at Seoul. The division railhead was changed to Munsan-ni. The 1st Marine unit to depart for West Korea was the KMC Regiment with its organic battalion of artillery. Since the artillery had to be moved and repositioned all across the front with as little interruption as possible and overall support available at any one time, the 11th Marine CO planned to move his battalions directly into their new firing positions. This was preceded by an initial detailed reconnaissance. Elements of the U.S. 25th Infantry side-slipped to the right and assumed responsibility for the Marine sector on the 17th. And the KMCs and the 1st Battalion, 11th Marines moved into their new positions on 18 March. The other artillery battalions followed at 2-day intervals, all battalions firing from their new positions by 24 March. The movement of the 1st Armored Amphibian Battalion, Less Company A, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John T. O'Neill, was an unforgettable experience. Embarking on LSTs manned by a skeleton Japanese crew, the vessels headed for the Kimpo Peninsula. The weather was squally and foggy throughout, and the ships were completely blacked out at night with no facilities for emergency transmission of messages. There were many navigational hazards, but in spite of this, and the lack of adequate navigational equipment, the LSTs arrived at their destination without incident. 2 days later, on 20 September, the 1st Tank Battalion and the anti-tank companies of the 3 infantry regiments also took the sea route to the new division area in the west. Division Operation Order 8-52, dated 18 March, directed the 1st Marines to proceed by motor march from the division reserve area at Camp Tripoli to the new division area east of Munsan-ni, and there to move into frontline positions. The 7th Marines, after being relieved on the 20th by elements of the 8th Rock Division, assembled at Camp Tripoli and moved by truck to West Korea. Colonel Austin R. Brunelli, who had replaced Colonel Custis Burton, Jr. as Chief of Staff, moved the forward CP personnel and prepared the new division command post. After being relieved by the Rocks on the 23rd, the 5th Marines departed their East Coast area. 2 days later, the regiment arrived in the Munsan-ni area behind the 7th Marines and the remaining elements of the artillery regiment. The 5th Marines had originally been scheduled to occupy reserve positions on the Kimpo Peninsula, but plans were changed en route. The commanding general and his G3 were appalled at the division sector's width, and after General Selden had a chance to inspect the areas to be defended and talk over the situation with the commanders of the 1st and 7th Marines, Colonel Sidney S. Wade and Colonel Russell E. Hansowitz, he decided that the 5th Marines should go into the line. A few hours after the 5th Marines convoy left the East Coast on their 140-mile Trans-Korea move, helicopters picked up the regimental and battalion commanders from their respective vehicles in the convoy and took them to the new division CP. They were assigned new defensive sectors and immediately reconnoitered the ground while awaiting the arrival of their units. By the time the regiment arrived, all preparations were made for them to move into positions and relieve a portion of the thinly stretched line of the 1st Marines. It had been a busy week for the 1st and 7th Motor Transport Battalions, commanded respectively by Lieutenant Colonel Howard E. Wortman and Major Herbert E. Pierce. 200 division trucks and a like number of U.S. Army vehicles made up the long columns that shuttled back and forth across the peninsula. The plan provided for moving an infantry regiment every 3rd day. For the drivers, this meant a 140-mile trip, a return trip the following day, and a 1-day layover for maintenance before commencing the new cycle. The artillery battalions, by order of 10 Corps, were retained until the latest possible date. The statistics of Operation Mixmaster are impressive. It took 5,716 truckloads and 80 DUKW loads to move most of the division personnel, gear, and supplies. 63 lowboys, flatbed trailers, and 83 railroad cars were also utilized in addition to hundreds of jeeps and jeep trailers. 3 LSDs and 11 LSTs sailed from Sakcho-ri to Inchon with the heaviest equipment. During the previous winter, a sizable number of prefabricated shelters had been set up for supporting and headquarters units. Since timber, logs, and salvage materials were in short supply, the 1st Marine Division moved large quantities of these materials to the West Coast in order to live as comfortably as possible under static warfare conditions. The operations of the 1st Marine Division in the defense of the western sector of Line Jamestown do not come within the scope of Volume 4. The account of Marine activities in the new sector, under the operational control of 1 Corps, will be discussed in the 5th and final volume of this series. Operations of 15 months in retrospect. During 1951, the Korean War became a most unpopular military venture among Americans. As a consequence, letters and newspapers from home caused a certain amount of anxiety among citizen soldiers in Korea. To counter any spirit of doubt which may have arisen, military leaders issued frank and honest replies to inquiring politicians. The esprit de corps of the Marines was high, and they were well aware of their purpose in Korea. One noted author, on spending a couple of days among frontline Marines during January of 1952, told a group of officers at the Division CP that he was impressed with the morale of the Marines on the MLR. He stated that he had been prepared to find that they didn't know what they were fighting for or why they were there. However, he was encouraged to find that they knew exactly their purpose in the Korean fighting. The period of nearly 15 months covered by Volume 4 was at that time the longest stretch of land warfare ever experienced by a major Marine unit. Even during the numerous island-hopping campaigns of World War II, the periods of combat were relatively brief for each. Glancing back over the year 1951 with the benefit of hindsight, it is evident that Marine uncommon valor during this period was supplemented by such outstanding innovations as helicopter-borne assaults and lightweight body armor, concepts brought to fruition by the pressure of combat. It is also apparent that Marine training, both for officers and enlisted men, paid off handsomely under the demands of practically every type of land warfare. The division chalked up a commendable record of service fighting on the East Central Front. Since the UN commander desired to have USAC's only amphibious-trained and equipped division near a coast offering a suitable selection of landing beaches, the division was originally positioned in the east. Not since the Inchon landing, however, had the Marines been employed in their specialty, amphibious assault. Subsequent to the unprecedented Chosin Reservoir Campaign of late 1950, the division reorganized and refitted in South Korea near Masan. Then in January and February of 1951 came the prolonged guerrilla hunting campaign some 60 air miles north of Masan. Division operations in this area covered more than 1,000 square miles. The mountainous terrain offered cover and concealment for the clandestine operations of far too many enemy groups. A solution to this problem was found in rice paddy patrols, groups ranging from a fire team to a squad in size, which penetrated the mountain areas on foot to flush out small enemy bands. In retrospect, had one squadron of helicopters been available at that time, and its quick lift capabilities utilized, the increased mobility and surveillance would have made quite a difference in the conduct of the action. Although land-based Marine air power had been under operational control of the 5th Air Force during the Chosin Reservoir fighting, a verbal agreement allowed the 1st MAW commander to provide directly necessary support to the 1st Marine Division. At the same time, carrier-based Marine planes were flying on the West Coast along with other Allied planes harassing enemy traffic. During the guerrilla hunt, VMO-6 planes provided air support to the 1st Marine Division while Marine attack aircraft were busy elsewhere along the 8th Army front. Marine pilots, operating under JOC control, felt frustrated because they were unable to provide the timely close air support desired by the infantry. The Marine viewpoint held that too many links in the Air Force system of control caused an excessive delay in bringing air power over the target. This system continued for the remainder of the year. As an operation, the guerrilla hunt was merely a series of minor engagements, but it accomplished its purpose of clearing out most of the North Korean irregulars who had been a constant threat in the 8th Army's rear. In addition, the numerous small patrols provided excellent training for the newly arrived replacements. The 8th Army seemed to gain new vitality under General Ridgway. On the 18th of February, when the general learned that the enemy was withdrawing, he ordered a limited offensive. Operation Killer began 3 days later and was followed by Operation Ripper on 7 March. The purpose of these operations was twofold. 1. General Ridgway wanted to restore his army's fighting spirit after its 2 defeats during the 1950 to 1951 winter. And 2. He wished to keep the Chinese Reds off balance while they prepared for another communist offensive. For the Marines, these 2 operations were an experience with a strictly limited offensive. The advance was buttoned up as major units paid close attention to lateral contact. As the advance continued into March and April, mud proved to be an adversary second only to a formidable enemy using delaying tactics, and the division as a whole had a thorough workout in the logistics of the offensive under adverse conditions. In early April, the division, as part of the 8th Army, crossed the 38th parallel and continued the attack to the north, the purpose being to threaten the suspected enemy buildup for an offensive. USAC forces rolled onward while the enemy, using his roving defensive tactics, fought vigorously and withdrew. The long-expected enemy counterblow fell on the night of 22 April and resulted in the 1st Marine Division bearing the brunt of a 48-hour attack. This opening CCF assault in the 10-Corps area of east-central Korea was intended to throw the 8th Army off balance as a preliminary to aiming the main blow at 1 Corps in West Korea. The CCF attack opened a hole in the MLR large enough for a major breakthrough, and the Communists apparently expected to exploit this success to the fullest. However, the Allied line pulled back, consolidated, and held, as the division's reserve regiment was thrown in to stem the tide. As the Marine flank was refused, the units on the left found themselves facing to the west while stopping the enemy thrust. Slowly, trading space for time, the Marines contained the enemy attack while the entire 8th Army line organized new positions. The enemy effort ground to a halt in the east-central sector, and the Chinese Reds were contravened in their attempt to take Seoul by Mayday. Surprise and impetus were lost on the Western Front when they struck several days later, only to be stopped with frightful losses after a few gains on regimental fronts. The Allied line now held firm. The division's war of maneuver had worked well in halting this round of the CCF offensive, but the Communists were far from finished. As 17 enemy divisions were still available to attack, the Marine Division was shifted to the east on 1 May in preparation for an expected battle. On the 16th of May, the Chinese offensive again opened, with the enemy hitting more to the east than had been expected and making a deep but narrow penetration near the coast. The Marines moved eastward, established blocking positions, and engaged fringe units of the drive. This allowed the right flank Army Division to move farther east and break the enemy's rush. The enemy was dangerously overextended when the UN counterstroke hit him late in May. For a month, the 8th Army attacked and advanced, the Marines slugging ahead day after day in the 10-corps zone of action. CCF casualties mounted high, and Marine veterans of only a few months of Korean service saw scores of enemy corpses left behind on the battlefield as the enemy withdrew northward. This great UN counteroffensive netted prisoners all along the USAC front as remnants of CCF platoons and even companies threw down their arms. Marines captured their share. Upwards of 10,000 Chinese surrendered to the Allies in a 10-day period, more prisoners than had been taken up to this time. As the Chinese withdrew northward, they left determined NKPA troops behind. The 1st Marine Division moved slowly forward, fighting for every inch of ground. So fierce was the enemy's resistance that at times during June the division commander was forced to commit all 4 regiments, the KMCs included, in the attack at the same time in order to seize designated objectives. This was a modification of accepted tactical doctrine, necessitated by the situation. Throughout March, April, and part of May, Marine pilots continued to provide close air support not only for the 1st Marine Division, but also for other Allied units as directed by Jock. From the beginning of Operation Strangle on 20 May, this interdiction effort had first priority, and close air support to all infantry units was secondary. Difficulties in air-ground communication continued as radio frequencies were heavily burdened with traffic. Although the 1st Marine Division received a proportionate share of the few air support missions flown, the frustrating time lag between requests for air support and the arrival of planes on target continued into the next year. Some planes were always available for frontline support, although rarely ever enough according to infantrymen's opinion. When they had the chance, 1st MAW pilots viciously attacked the fleeing enemy to ease the way for advancing ground troops. During June, the unrelenting pressure of combined air-ground attacks sometimes caused large groups of enemy to surrender. Marines also captured thousands of rounds of enemy ammunition and other equipment. By the last week in June, the Marines had entrenched themselves along the division's assigned portion of the MLR and caught their breath after 2 months of hard fighting. In driving from the Chosin Reservoir area to the punchbowl, they had employed practically every weapon and tactic that could be used in an all-out offensive. The division then settled down to stable positions for a while, and some units had the opportunity to go into reserve and train. It was a recharged 1st Marine Division. The 5th and 11th Marines did not go into reserve during this period, which moved back into the lines at the end of August. The offensive, which opened northeast of the punchbowl on the 30th and lasted with few and brief interludes until 20 September, was the equal of the June fighting in sustained ferocity. All 4 infantry regiments, including the KMCs, went up against seemingly impregnable opposition. The enemy's stubborn defense of strong positions and many well-placed log and earth bunkers was similar to the tenacious tactics of the Japanese in World War II, according to a Navy report. His artillery and mortar fires were effective, his minefields continued to be hazardous for many weeks, and his ability to dig in and fortify his positions was always impressive. After the 20th of September, the USAC commander ordered that no further offensives be launched and that the MLR be stabilized. This was a period of aggressive patrolling, local attacks for more advantageous pieces of terrain, and watchful waiting to determine the outcome of truce negotiations. In spite of Operation Strangle, enemy vehicular movements increased at the end of the year, but 1st MAW pilots continually attempted to provide more support for all the infantry divisions. The mission of the 1st Marine Division at this time was to organize, construct, and defend its sector of the MLR, a front of more than 13 miles. Although there were heavy local skirmishes, during the latter months of 1951 and the first 3 months of 1952, no great offensive drives were launched. Essentially, the Marines were engaged in an aggressive defense of their positions until they moved to West Korea. While all Marines were hoping that the conflict would soon end, there was no slackening of the customary vigilance. All hands remembered General Ridgway's words of the previous year, that it was a fight for our own freedom, our own survival, and this was their creed. These lines would have made a fitting epitaph for Marines who gave their lives in Korea. They had as worthy a cause as any fighting men of our history, for it had become increasingly plain since World War II that a stand must eventually be made against communist encroachments. By going halfway around the world to fight the enemy on his own doorstep, Americans may well have spared themselves a more bloody and costly future struggle near to their own homeland, if not actually on their own soil. The designs of Red China and Soviet Russia were unmasked in Korea, and the people of the United States awakened to their peril after neglecting the nation's defenses since 1945. To that extent, therefore, the operations in Korea were a defeat for communism. End of Chapter 12, Part 2.